If you subscribe to me, I'd be most pleased. This case takes place in the USA in the 1970s and 80s. In August of 1987, deep within Oregon's remote Molalla forest, a lone bow hunter stumbled across a grim discovery. Hidden amongst the dense trees lay the remains of a body, and within just days, investigators unearthed 6 more bodies. Whoever had done this, it was clear to see that the Molalla forest became his dumping ground. Meet Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dayton was born on the 30th of September 1953 in Moscow, Idaho. He was raised in a religious working-class family and spent his early years helping out at his father's small engine repair shop. On the surface, his childhood appeared to be somewhat ordinary, but inside the home, there were reports of violence and dysfunction. Dayton's father was an abusive man. He even killed family pets by gassing them or running them over with a car. His mother also contributed to the chaos, and in some very disturbing ways. She often walked around the home barely clothed and confided in young Dayton that intercourse with his father was painful and unsatisfying. These early experiences shaped Dayton's psyche. Because of this, he learned to associate sex with shame, pain, and control at a formative age. He became a loner and showed early signs of emotional instability and deep anger. By the 7th grade, at around 13 years old, he was arrested for shooting a BB gun at passing cars. By 16, he was already known to carry knives and get into trouble, and just 2 years later, at 18, he began to use those knives. In 1972, Dayton lured a girl, whom he had previously taken on a date, into a wooded area near Eugene, Oregon. Dayton planned to force himself upon her, but instead of doing this, he just took out his hunting knife and stabbed her repeatedly in the abdomen, and was about to leave her to die. But remarkably, the girl survived, and she did this by convincing Dayton to take her to the hospital. She promised she would marry him if he helped her, and she promised to forgive him. In a bizarre way, this ploy saved her life. She obviously immediately told the police what Dayton had done to her, and within just days he was arrested for the attack. When Dayton was facing serious charges for the Woodland attack, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation. It's here when he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, indicating a disturbed mental state with difficulty in normal social relationships. In February of 1973, he pleaded guilty to the attack and was sentenced with leniency due to his mental condition. Instead of prison, Dayton received a 4-year term of probation and was sent to Oregon State Hospital for treatment. Because he wasn't placed behind bars, he still had his freedom to leave the house. So of course, he violated his probation terms many times. On one occasion in 1973, only months after the first attack, he attacked 2 more teenage girls under frightening circumstances. He picked the girls up in his car and gave them alcohol until they were intoxicated. He then tied up both of the girls and essayed them in front of each other during a horrific attack. The encounter turned chaotic when Dayton crashed his vehicle and he got stuck in the mud in a field. Seizing an opportunity, the captive girls managed to escape and ran for help as Dayton struggled with his disabled car. Police soon arrested him again, and this time, doctors discovered that Dayton had suffered a head injury. He had brain damage to his right frontal lobe caused by the car crash during the attack. In the legal aftermath, Dayton was charged with multiple accounts of assault. However, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent back to the state psychiatric hospital for further treatment. This time, he was secured from leaving. But by November of 1974, he was discharged into the public after doctors deemed him fit to leave, which, looking back, seems extremely hard to understand. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dayton continued to cycle in and out of the justice system. He racked up accusations of violent SA offences, but often avoided long-term consequences. Yet despite these obvious red flags, a pattern of picking up young women and subjecting them to extreme violence, Dayton managed to stay mostly free. By the early 80s, he even married a woman named Sherry, and eventually became a father. To most people, he appeared to be an unremarkable mechanic and a family man, but underneath that facade, Dayton's disturbing urges only grew stronger. By the mid-1980s, Dayton was a ticking time bomb of violent compulsions. He had a well-honed method for finding victims that initially drew little attention. Dayton preferred what he called street women, women struggling with addiction or working as ladies of the night. He knew that these people were less likely to be reported missing. In Portland, Oregon's red light district, Dayton developed a predatory reputation. Local women who worked the streets found him to be incredibly odd and unsettling. He gave a false name on these streets, introducing himself as Steve the Gambler. He was known to the girls to have a particular demand. He enjoyed bondage and pain, and he fixated on women's feet, and this fetish would later play a gruesome role in his crimes. Dayton's modus operandi was chillingly consistent. Cruising in his pickup truck, he would solicit a woman or a hitchhiker, offering these women money for a good time. He often sweetened the deal by requesting unusual but seemingly consensual acts. To some women, this seemed like a good deal. But in his truck, he kept all kinds of tools and binding equipment, including extra-long shoelaces, wires, and even dog collars. Items he would use to hog-tie his victims and choke them into submission. He was also usually armed with at least one knife, and then later a hacksaw. Dayton was also a heavy drinker, and he often became intoxicated before or during his attacks. He was known to consume vodka mixed with orange juice, called a screwdriver cocktail. But this habit would later be a crucial clue linking him to the crime scenes. In the moment, however, the alcohol emboldened his cruelty. In the summer of 1987, Dayton's violence escalated from sporadic attacks to a full-blown spree. Around June of 1987, women began vanishing from Portland's 82nd Avenue and downtown streets, and it happened in rapid succession. These were women who were known to frequent Portland's bars and work the streets, often to support habits or make ends meet. Dayton picked up these women one by one. First, he would gain their trust, get them drunk, and have them bound in the truck. He often tied fancy knots in a way that suggested he enjoyed the process of restraining them. Next, he would take them to a woodland, just as he did with his first ever attempted murder. He favoured the remote woodlands of the Molalla River corridor. This was an isolated area of private forestlands around 30 miles south of Portland. There, deep amongst the trees and far from prying eyes, Dayton's darkest impulses ran free. He exposed his victims to prolonged beatings, stabbings, essays, and cut them in ways to inflict pain without killing them. He would often focus his knife on certain parts of the body. This would be the chest, the abdomen, and especially the feet. Each new victim seemed to drive Dayton to further extremes of brutality, as though he were trying to satisfy something deep within him that was insatiable. Yet, no matter how much pain he ever inflicted, it was never enough for him. Dayton's double life went unnoticed by those close to him. He continued to return home to his wife and his young child in Oregon. After committing these heinous acts, he concealed any evidence away from his family. They had no idea. By late July of 1987, he had left a string of corpses in the forest. These women were Retha Giles, aged 16, Tonya Johnston, aged 18, Cynthia Dean DeVore, aged 20, Lisa Mock, 23, Nondan Cervantes, aged 26, Maureen Hodges, aged 26, and Christine Adams, aged 35. 7 victims. But, for Dayton, there was room for one more. In the early morning hours of the 7th of August 1987, Dayton committed one last act that ultimately led to his downfall. His final victim was Jennifer Lisa Smith, a 25-year-old mother of 2 who needed money. Dayton picked Jennifer up on Portland's Union Avenue and drove her to a Denny's car park. It was gone midnight when Dayton began his familiar routine with Jennifer. He persuaded her to remove her clothing and allowed him to bind her wrists and ankles with shoelaces. Jennifer likely expected a quick transaction, but tragically, it wasn't. Jennifer found herself hogtied and lying face down on the truck seat, tied up on her hands and knees, with her hands and feet secured behind her back against the dashboard. In this vulnerable position, she could do little to fight back when Dayton suddenly grabbed for his knife. He then began his frenzied attack. Dayton had stabbed Jennifer at least 7 times in her chest, abdomen, back, and her neck. Multiple witnesses in the vicinity were alerted by Jennifer's piercing screams at around 2:30 a.m. A woman named Sherry was inside the nearby Denny's when she heard the shrieks and ran outside to help. What she and others saw was truly horrifying. Jennifer had actually managed to escape her bindings and stumbled out of the pickup truck. She was completely naked and covered in blood. She was able to make it just a few meters across the car park, but soon she fell, and Dayton stood over her with a knife in his hand. Jennifer was gravely injured. Her throat had been cut, and she had been stabbed all over her body. She was bleeding profusely and struggling to breathe, yet somehow she was still alive in that moment. Dayton had noticed that his actions had aroused attention. He was about to be caught, so he took off on foot towards his truck. Sherry rushed to the young woman's side and pressed her hands against the stab wounds, desperately trying to stop the bleeding whilst telling Jennifer to hold on. Several other bystanders sprang into action as Dayton started the engine and sped out of the parking lot. 2 brave men leapt into their own cars and began to chase him down. In the chaos, some tried to block the lot's exits with their vehicles, but Dayton's pickup jumped the curb and tore across the vegetation to escape into the street. A high-speed pursuit then ensued throughout the dark suburban roads. One determined witness was 34-year-old Richard. He followed closely behind Dayton, reaching speeds up to 100 miles per hour. During this dangerous chase, Richard managed to get a clear view of Dayton's license plate. He knew he couldn't safely force the truck off the road, so instead, he reduced his speed and wrote down the plate number on a scrap of paper before returning to Denny's to hand it over to the police. Tragically, Jennifer Lisa Smith could not be saved. She suffered massive internal bleeding and organ damage, including deep punctures to her lungs and her heart. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, making her the 8th and final murder victim. Or so we know. Once the police got the license plate, they were able to find Dayton's residence at dawn. When they got there, they learned from his family that he might be at his engine repair shop in Woodburn. At around 5:35 a.m., the police arrived at the shop and found Dayton inside. Right away, the police noticed blood smears on Dayton's boots and around the shop entrance. It was also clear that he had been drinking. When the police asked him what he had been doing that night and why his boots were covered in blood, he immediately lied. He claimed he had injured himself with a saw, but he was fine now because he drove to the hospital for treatment. He then went on to say that he had been at his garage ever since. But things just didn't add up. His pickup truck was parked out front and the engine was still warm. Sensing they had their man, the deputies arrested Dayton on suspicion of murder and secured the area for a thorough search. Physical evidence linking Dayton to the murder was plentiful. During Dayton's escape at the Denny's parking lot, he had dropped his knife. Forensic tests found human tissue and blood on the knife consistent with Jennifer's wounds, and Jennifer Smith's fingerprints were found inside Dayton's truck. With these pieces of evidence alone, the case against Dayton for Jennifer's murder was strong. But it was only the beginning. Inside the shop itself, investigators found a blood-stained hacksaw hanging prominently on the wall, and further scrutiny of the shop uncovered a wood-burning stove. It contained burnt fragments of women's clothing, bra clasps, metal buttons, and shoe components that Dayton attempted to incinerate. There were also bits of belt buckles and distinctive clothing studs, including star-shaped jean studs later identified as matching a pair of pants worn by a victim, Christine Adams. Detectives also found clumps of human hair scattered in his pickup truck, leading the police to believe that there were many more victims. They also found numerous bloodstains in the truck's passenger seat, footwell, and ceiling. The blood belonged to multiple people. At this initial stage, the police had no idea that they had a serial killer in their cells. There was no knowledge of the Molalla forest burial sites. Police were unaware of the horrifying significance of these items, but they had recognized that they had likely uncovered a potential crime scene of staggering brutality, far more extensive than the single murder for which he had been arrested. During the initial interviews, Dayton denied any wrongdoing or just remained silent. However, the true extent of what he had done would soon come to light. Just days after the murder, on the 31st of August, a bow hunter stumbled upon a woman's remains on a privately owned forest near Molalla. Suffice to say, the discovery triggered a massive search of the nearby area. Over the next few days, the police located 6 more bodies scattered throughout the woods. At that point, authorities had 7 unidentified female victims from one site. 6 of these victims were later positively identified, but not until the end of the investigation. The 7th, Tonya Marie Johnson, would remain a Jane Doe for decades to come. The crime scene painted a picture of methodical sadism. Forensic examination showed he had bound, stabbed, and in many cases, carved up the bodies after death. One victim was found with her abdomen grotesquely disemboweled with a deep, gashing slash that ran from below her breastbone down to her pubic area. One of her nipples had also been sliced off. Lisa Marie Mock had suffered deep stab wounds to her lower back, and most shockingly, both of her feet had been sawn off at the ankles. Investigators discovered Lisa's severed feet carefully placed beneath her corpse, as if the killer had handled them with particular attention. The body of Reatha Giles displayed 6 stab wounds to her lower back, and one of her lower legs had been cut through with a saw, detaching her foot at the ankle. Christine Lotus Adams had a stab wound to the back, and her right foot was completely severed and was actually missing from the scene. Christine's wrists were still bound together by a leather dog collar when her remains were found, her arms tied above her head. The remains of Maureen Ann Hodges had been disturbed by scavenging animals. Her legs below the knee were never recovered. Even the last victim, 20-year-old Cynthia DeVore, whose body was mostly skeletal by the time of discovery, showed evidence of vicious stabbing in her upper back. The investigators noted just how the victims had extensive wounds to their private areas. The pattern of mutilation was not random in the slightest. Ultimately, each of these victims died alone in the woods, suffering extraordinary pain and terror in their final moments. The police knew straight away that the crimes were undertaken by a single perpetrator, and it just so happened that less than a month ago, the police had arrested a man for murder with evidence of other victims. Suspicion quickly focused on Dayton after the women all matched a similar profile to Jennifer. Sheriffs began cross-referencing evidence from the forest scene with the ongoing Dayton investigation. At the Molalla forest site, technicians collected dozens of items that seemed out of place in the wilderness. There were 38 empty miniature vodka bottles of the same brand, and 34 orange juice containers found littered around the victim recovery sites. Investigators recalled that Dayton had mentioned buying miniatures of vodka the night of Jennifer's murder. This clue gained significance as more was learned about Dayton's habits. Detectives confirmed from a nearby liquor store that Dayton often purchased 10 packs of vodka minis, the exact found in the forest. But even more damning were the tools and trace evidence linking Dayton's truck and workshop to the forest crimes. Forensic analysis later matched that hacksaw to distinctive cut marks found on the bones of multiple victims. The saw's blade width and the tooth pattern matched the marks found on the ankles of Lisa Mock and Christine Adams. But at this point, the police didn't know whose corpses they were. They combed through missing persons reports from summer of 1987 and started putting names to the forest remains. By mid-September of 1987, they were able to identify at least 4 of the victims through dental records. The police also began interviewing local street workers to see if any of these women had survived a terrifying encounter with a client matching Dayton's description. And indeed, a few women recounted close calls, including one woman named Heather. Thankfully, she was able to escape on her way to the forest. These survivors' accounts gave further insight into Dayton's methods and helped investigators firm up the case that one man was behind all of these attacks. By early 1988, the investigators had finally gathered enough evidence to charge Dayton with multiple counts of aggravated murder for the forest killings. The aggravating factor being that he committed intentional murder with deliberate cruelty. But prosecutors only had a solid case for Jennifer, so Jennifer's case was handled separately and first. The trial for the murder of Jennifer began in 1988, and the case drew media attention. During the trial, the prosecution methodically laid out the harrowing facts. Witnesses from the Denny's parking lot testified to the attack they saw that night. Sherry, the lady who saw the attack, later recounted hearing Jennifer's screams and finding her bleeding profusely on the pavement. But perhaps most damning, a state criminalist testified that a fingerprint on Dayton's truck belonged to Jennifer. Confronted with this overwhelming evidence, the jury deliberated only briefly. In 1988, Dayton Rogers was found guilty of aggravated murder in the death of Jennifer Lisa Smith. The case then moved to a penalty phase to determine his sentence. Under Oregon law at the time, a separate mini-trial was conducted to decide between execution or life imprisonment for an aggravated murder conviction. Without even knowing that Dayton was a suspected serial killer, the jury saw the parking lot murder as egregious enough for the maximum penalty. In 1988, they sentenced Dayton to death. It said that he showed absolutely zero remorse during the entire trial. Meanwhile, the county district attorney moved forward with the far larger case, charging Dayton with the murders of the women found in the forest. In early 1989, a grand jury indicted Dayton on multiple accounts of aggravated murder. The trial for the forest murders took place in 1989 and lasted several weeks, with graphic evidence and emotional testimony. Family members of the victims watched as prosecutors presented the forensic puzzle that tied Dayton to each woman. Survivors of Dayton's prior attacks in the 1970s also testified, giving jurors a chilling picture of a man who had been committing acts of extreme violence for years. The prosecution's case was airtight. The defense, facing daunting evidence, did not contest that Dayton killed these women. Their strategy instead was sparing Dayton's life by emphasizing his mental problems and his childhood. They hoped to garner some sympathy to spare his life. But this effort proved to be unsuccessful. In May of 1989, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts of the forest murders. At the penalty phase of his trial, the prosecutors recounted the full horror of how Dayton hogtied, carved up, and dumped these victims into the woods. The jurors hearing this were visibly shaken, and many needed some help after the trial was conducted. For a second time, the jury unanimously sentenced Dayton to death for the murders. With those verdicts, Dayton entered Oregon's death row in 1989. Justice was finally served. Well, almost. Unfortunately, the battle was far from over. Over the next 3 decades, Dayton's case became notorious for not only the gruesome crimes, but also for the series of appeals and overturned sentences that followed. The Oregon Supreme Court automatically reviewed his death sentence, and in 1992, they issued a landmark decision, vacating Dayton's initial death sentence from the Jennifer trial. As a result of this, Dayton was entitled to a new sentencing hearing. In 1994, at the retrial for his penalty, a second jury again heard the gruesome details, and once more, they decided on death. Yet again, in the year 2000, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned that death sentence due to some legal technicalities. But each time a sentence was vacated, Dayton had to be resentenced, forcing the victims' families to endure new hearings and to hear again in great detail what their family members suffered. A third penalty phase trial in 2006 resulted in Dayton being sentenced to death for the third time by a jury. And this too didn't stick. In 2012, the Oregon Supreme Court nullified the 2006 death sentence. These repeated legal do-overs were agonizing for the victims' loved ones. They saw Dayton continually escape final punishment on procedural grounds. Finally, in November of 2015, Dayton faced a fourth sentencing trial. It was nearly 28 years after his crimes had taken place. Once more, a jury heard the case for life in prison or death. The defense brought in a forensic psychologist who argued that at 62 years old and having spent decades in prison, Dayton now supposedly posed almost no risk of committing future violence if he was spared execution and placed in the general inmate population. The expert claimed that aging inmates as a whole become less dangerous over time. However, the prosecution was there to really drill home just how vicious and vile Dayton truly is, and how he took great pleasure from his victims' pain, terror, and mutilation. On the 16th of November 2015, the jury sentenced Dayton to death for the fourth time. In Oregon's history, no other convicted killer has been sent to death this many times. And guess what? This wasn't even the final chapter. In November of 2021, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned Dayton's death sentence once again. Oregon's legislature had narrowed down the legal definition of aggravated murder, effectively removing the death penalty option for murderers like Dayton. And before the county could conduct a fifth sentencing, Oregon's governor intervened. On the 13th of December 2022, Governor Kate Brown changed the sentences of all 17 people on Oregon's death row. This of course included Dayton. His sentence was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And with this, Dayton's decades-long journey through the court system effectively ended. Meanwhile, whilst all of this was going on, there was a major development. An unknown victim of the forest was finally identified through advanced DNA testing. She was identified as Tonya Marie Johnson, who was only 18 when Dayton took her life. This gave a name to the last Jane Doe and allowed her family to claim her remains at long last. As of today, Dayton is incarcerated for life with absolutely zero chance of release. As of right now, he is in his early 70s, and Dayton is destined to die in prison. For the families of the women he killed, there is some comfort in knowing that Dayton will never walk free. However, many have expressed frustration that true justice was delayed for so long by the appeals process. As one prosecutor noted, the case of Dayton became a decades-long legal saga that truly tested the endurance of everyone involved. Since being incarcerated, Dayton did apologize for his crimes. He said, "The enormity of my crimes makes the word sorry all but inadequate. It would seem like an insult to even say it, but I still need to say it. Whether it's received or not, I am sorry. So very sorry."